This week on the farm, we had all these herbs in our garden that needed to be used, as well as some wild dandelion and other bitter greens like cavallo nero, and I had a craving for a dish my grandmother used to make called hortopita. It's very similar to spanakopita, with spinach and feta and phyllo pastry, but hortopita is made using a mix of wild greens and lots of herbs. As some of you know, my grandparents were both Greek, and I think that's why I love cooking so often with vegetables, because I really grew up thinking of them as this delicious part of life rather than something you had to eat for nutrition. This footage is from a trip to the Greek islands from a few years ago. Now, I have an insatiable sweet tooth, and I know many of you ask when you see me baking desserts like last week's sticky date pudding how I stay healthy. The truth is, when I have a treat, I like to completely indulge and just go all out. But 80% of my cooking and my diet is quite clean and plant-based. So I thought I'd share with you a typical dish I make for dinner and eat the next day for lunch. Actually, I most often make this with a whole wheat or wholemeal pastry, which is what my mother always cooked when we were growing up. But I thought that's actually hard for some of you to replicate at home because wholemeal or whole wheat pastry has to be perfect, otherwise it's like cardboard. So I'm making phyllo pastry from scratch, which is actually easier than you might think. While often you'll see spanakopita or any kind of spinach parcels with a very thin layer of spinach and lots of pastry, in my family we always had this as a main meal and wanted to leave the pastry to a minimum to keep it wholesome so that it's actually good for you. Otherwise, it's just like eating pastries with a little tiny bit of vegetable flavoring. Trust me, this will still be the most delicious dish with flaky, buttery pastry, salty, juicy filling, fragrant with herbs and lemons that will transport you to a Greek island. I picked thyme, wild fennel leaves, mint, oregano, dill, marjoram, rosemary, and some wild bitter greens growing on the hillside. We also had cavallo nero that my mother planted, which is like kale or silver beet. And finally, I bought some baby spinach leaves. So I start with the phyllo pastry because the longer you leave the dough to rest, the better. To some flour, I add fine sea salt, mix it a little, and then add some olive oil and some white wine vinegar. And some people put the warm water in straight away, but I like to mix my dough by hand and add the water in increments so that I can feel when it has come together so I don't risk adding too much water. As always, I'll put all the measurements on my recipe page on carlyflavel.com, but your flour and the humidity in your room will affect your quantity of water, so really try to use your instincts. This is how my grandmother cooked, and consequently she never wrote anything down or properly taught me to cook. I just watched her attentively my whole life and devoured every mouthful, analyzing each individual flavor. So you see, you want it to just come together and then cover it and leave it to rest for 1 to 2 hours, which is fine because we will be busy with the filling. Clearly, I'm no expert, but my understanding is that the difference between spanakopita and hortopita is that spanakopita uses spinach and feta, maybe with a bit of dill, whereas hortopita uses a mix of bitter greens. These are all from our garden, so they have a bit of soil on them. I just fill 2 bowls with water, and this way I can rinse them well in batches. I'll always remember my grandmother would make us laugh because she would come up to our house and on her way up the front steps, she would see what we would class as weeds and she would just smile delightedly and crouch down to pick them and eat them or put them in her pocket for cooking later with lemon, garlic and olive oil. Of course, nowadays, my sister, who is a nutritionist, says the Greeks are so clever in consuming basketfuls of dark, bitter greens because they're full of minerals, antioxidants, and fiber that help us stay lean and vital, promote longevity, give us beautiful, clear skin, and basically do a world of good for the gut and digestion. I'm just removing some of the hard stalks and roughly chopping the herbs and wild greens. Everyone always thinks of Italy as the land of only pizza and pasta, but actually Italians are also devoted to bitter greens like cicoria and bietola, chicory and chard, sautéed in a little garlic, lemon juice and olive oil. It's a dish you'll find in almost every trattoria, but I never see tourists ordering it. You can choose however many herbs you want to add, but here I have 200 grams once they are chopped and de-stalked. Here I have some homegrown cavolo nero, which is similar to kale or silver beet. I like to just remove the tough stalk running through the middle, and this gets roughly chopped as well. Now we want the fresh citrus note of the zest and juice of a whole lemon. I add some sea salt, but don't oversalt because we have got the feta cheese coming. If I were just using sweet spinach, I would use less salt, but cavolo nero and the herbs are quite bitter. So I just added some dried oregano and black pepper. Dried and fresh herbs do different things to a dish, so I like using both of them. And now we want 3 eggs. This is some fresh local ricotta, and at this point it already smells heavenly. Herbs and creamy ricotta and tangy lemon. And then add some olive oil. You'll want to find the biggest pot or bowl you own. I like to layer in my greens, then herbs, then the wet mixture in batches so that it's easier to stir and really get it all combined. Now, I save my spinach until last because I want to look at the baking dish and make a judgment on how much spinach I'll add based on that volume. This gets chopped and added. You can't really go wrong with this, so you can adjust the ratios to your preference. Now, it may look like the greens aren't that coated, but this is fine. My grandmother never cooked the greens before baking the pie, and it makes for a much juicier and flavorful result. I like to just chop a red onion and fry it gently in a little olive oil. I suppose you could use scallions or spring onions, but we never use them in my family, so I'm in the habit of adding red onion. And I think it adds a little more sweetness than scallions. And these get added to our green mixture. Now the feta cheese. Just crumble it in. I add it after having mixed everything else so that it doesn't lose too much texture being stirred. And a pinch of nutmeg. Now, I would advise baking in the largest dish you own because this is so good. Everybody wants seconds, and then the next day you'll want plenty for lunch because it's just so good a few days later. My dish is 40 centimeters by 27 centimeters. Preheat the oven, and by the time we've rolled out the dough, it should be hot enough. I divide the dough into 6 pieces. I'll use 3 on the bottom and 3 on the top. So this amount of dough would work for a smaller baking dish because keep in mind I roll my pastry very, very thin because, as you know, I'm used to using a rolling pin, but you could go a little bit thicker or you could just do more layers, which is always nice. I put a little flour down, but honestly, this isn't a sticky dough, so you shouldn't have any trouble. In fact, you'll see that I don't add any more flour from now on. Now, when you first start, you may say, Kylie, this is never going to work. This piece of dough is far too small for the pan. Trust me, when you think you can't roll anymore, you always can. A little trick I do is I constantly flip my dough so that I'm always checking that it's not stuck to the table, and it helps me to keep both sides smooth, to really iron out any lumps and bumps. Try to start at the center and roll outwards in all directions. Otherwise, you're wasting energy just pushing thickness from one side of the pastry dough to the other. It's great exercise. I worked up such a sweat that I had to take my cardigan off. I was so hot. I've greased the pan with olive oil, and now I lay my first sheet down, roughly. It won't matter if it's not perfect. We start on the next one. Wherever 2 sheets of pastry are layered on each other, you want to add olive oil because this will help them lift off each other as they're cooking and create that lovely, crispy, layered flakiness. Now the filling goes in. See how delicate this is? It doesn't tear, but you should almost see the greens through it. One mistake I made here was not wrapping my dough airtight because I hate using cling wrap. So the dough dried a little on the outside. This is fine, you just need to roll harder and the little bumps smooth out. Instead of cling film, you could leave your dough to rest in an airtight Tupperware dish, I suppose, but I didn't do that. You could use frozen phyllo, but this pastry has a different quality. It's buttery and flaky, but also rustic and chewier. By the time you wait for frozen phyllo to defrost, you could just make these, which are traditional and so much more delicious, in my opinion. Look at this, isn't it beautiful? Our pie is almost done. It's so satisfying making a pie, don't you think? Now I add the third layer on top and just curl around the edges from the bottom layers, and this will ensure that we have a nice sealed crust because many people might like to just eat this with their fingers and sort of bite into it rather than cutting into it with a knife and fork. It's going to be much easier to slice up later if we cut the servings before it cooks and puffs up. Not down to the bottom, just the top layers of pastry. Now my pie is very thick, so this goes into the oven for 1.5 hours. At 1 hour, I take it out and I drizzle a little melted butter on top and then put it back. I wish you could taste this. First, there's the buttery light pastry and it just flakes and melts in your mouth. And then you chew down to the lower layers of pastry and then you taste salty feta and creamy ricotta And there's the fresh hit of wild fennel and oregano and mint and thyme and lemon. And as you chew, you get this glorious sensation of a Greek island in your mouth. It's the sea air, it's the wild hillside with the herbal scent wafting on the breeze, peppery olive oil, the sound of goats bleating. Maybe this is just all my memories, but I challenge you to make this wholesome, heartwarming comfort food. And although it's comforting and satisfying and delicious, it will actually nourish your loved ones. What could be better than that? Thank you to the wonderful people who donated this month to my channel via patreon.com/Carly Flavel. I hope you enjoyed this little rustic pie, and do tag me on Instagram if you make it. I really love seeing your interpretations of my cooking. Have a lovely weekend. I'll see you next Friday. Alla prossima.